They didn't warn. They didn't delay. They didn't hint. China simply struck. 16 American companies shut down in a single day, without mercy, without pause. Not temporarily, not partially, completely, in broad daylight. And while the West was still scrolling through TikToks and worrying about new mortgage rates, Beijing executed a surgical strike, strategically cutting off a vital sector of the American economy. And what did Washington do? Silence. But that silence isn't peace. It's the kind of silence that always comes before the wail of sirens. Now, let me break down why what happened on April 4th, 2025, wasn't just another round in a trade war. It marked the beginning of a systemic transformation, the effects of which we'll feel for years. Yes, Trump had just signed an order imposing new tariffs on Chinese imports totaling $88 billion. And in response, just 72 hours later, Beijing hit back, blocking the operations of 16 of America's largest companies on its soil. And here's where things get interesting. This wasn't a panicked reaction. It was a premeditated move. Bloomberg reports that the blacklist had been prepared weeks in advance, but was activated precisely when the White House began flexing its muscles again. It was a signal, not just to the U.S., to the entire global business community. Working with Taiwan, supplying surveillance tech or military hardware means risking access to the Chinese market. Among those blocked are giants: Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon Technologies, General Atomics. In just the last 4 years, they've sold nearly $8 billion worth of weapons to Taiwan. Also on the list are Palantir, Lattice Semiconductor, and drone maker AeroVironment. All of them are tied to military projects or dual-use technologies. This is no longer about trade retaliation. This is containment. Beijing is making it clear. Every move related to Taiwan will result in a blow to your budget. And it's not a hit to steel or soybean imports. It's a strike at the heart of the U.S. defense industry. The White House remains silent. Why? Perhaps because they don't know what China will do next. But Beijing does, and they're betting that U.S. indecision is now their greatest advantage. What's even more striking, China isn't using its own playbook. It's using America's. Yes, since 2018, the United States has imposed restrictions on more than 280 Chinese companies, including Huawei, ZTE, and many others. And it always invoked national security as justification. Now China is invoking its own export control law, enacted back in 2020. This law allows Beijing to block any foreign company whose activities threaten China's sovereignty or security. In other words, China just flipped the switch to U.S. mode. But here's the question. If Washington calls its sanctions defending democracy, then why are similar measures from Beijing labeled a threat to global stability? Reuters conducted a study of 1,200 headlines from 2021 to 2024. 89% of U.S. sanctions were described as security-driven steps. Meanwhile, 76% of Chinese sanctions were labeled as aggression. Why? Because narrative is also a weapon. Meanwhile, financial damage is already becoming a reality. Even if the companies themselves didn't have major projects in China, they are deeply embedded in supply chains. For example, Lattice Semiconductor and Teledyne Technologies rely on rare earth materials produced almost exclusively in China. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, in 2023, China accounted for 70% of global rare earth extraction and 87% of global processing. Without these materials, there are no drones, no microchips, no radars. Rand Corporation warned in a March 2025 report that a 30-day delay could set back U.S. defense shipments by 11 months. And now General Atomics, a supplier of drones for the Pentagon, is being forced to purchase gallium from Australia, which is 18% more expensive. But China hasn't yet restricted the export of these materials. It still hasn't pulled the trigger. The weapon is on the table, but not yet armed. Still, everyone sees it. And this didn't start yesterday. This is a continuation of the 2018 to 2020 trade war. Back then, the U.S. imposed tariffs on over $360 billion worth of Chinese goods. China responded with tariffs on agricultural products. But the real story isn't in the numbers, it's in the consequences. According to the Peterson Institute, during this period, China reduced its dependence on American imports in the high-tech sector by 38%. And in 2024, it spent $44.3 billion on semiconductor research and development, 62% more than before the trade war began. So what the U.S. tried to stop, it only accelerated. And today's blacklisting of 16 companies is not a tantrum. It's a calculated step in China's strategy for technological independence. And this is just the beginning, because today it's 16 companies. But tomorrow, while Washington waits, Beijing builds its own financial system, its own trade alliances, its own payment platforms. For instance, in just the first quarter of 2025, China already conducted 41% of its foreign trade in yuan. By comparison, in 2023, that figure was just 19%. In March, Egypt offered, for the first time, to accept payments for passage through the Suez Canal in yuan. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have begun signing energy contracts outside the dollar system. The world is quietly but steadily moving out from under the dollar's control. According to the IMF, in 2025, BRICS countries, now including Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, surpassed the G7 for the first time in PPP-adjusted GDP, 34.2% versus 29.8%. And while SWIFT and the IMF used to dominate, now we increasingly hear about CIPS and the digital yuan, which is already being used in 28 countries. This isn't rebellion. It's a full reprogramming of the global system. And now we come to the most important point. The blacklisting of 16 companies was a test balloon. But what if the next step is a ban on the export of neodymium and dysprosium? These materials are critical for the production of Tesla engines, F-35 fighter jets, and hundreds of other key technologies. And what if China goes even further and removes the dollar from all transactions in strategic sectors? Reuters has already reported, in the first quarter of 2025, China's central bank cut its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds by $29.3 billion. This is the largest reduction since 2016. This is no longer diversification. This is de-dollarization. And if you think this will stop here, think again. While Chinese state-owned corporations model dollar exit scenarios, and Beijing gradually cuts U.S. companies off from its supply chains, it all points to one outcome: systemic rupture. So, share your thoughts. Is this a controlled escalation, or the beginning of a quiet but irreversible decoupling? And if China can block Lockheed Martin today, what happens tomorrow? Share your opinion.